The morning started like any other Thursday in Riverside Oaks, a quiet suburban neighborhood where the lawns were always immaculate and the houses looked like they belonged in a magazine spread. The sun was barely above the horizon when Marcus Chun found an envelope wedged into his front door, sealed with the official stamp of the Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association. He pulled it free, noting the aggressive way it had been jammed into the doorframe, and tore it open while his coffee brewed in the kitchen. Inside was a letter that would change everything. The HOA board, led by their president Patricia Whitmore, had decided to impose a special assessment fee on his property. The reason cited was excessive vehicle storage, a violation of community standards, and what they called visual pollution. The fee was $1,500, due within 30 days, and the letter made it clear this was non-negotiable. Marcus read the letter 3 times, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief to something that resembled quiet amusement. The cars in question were parked legally in his driveway and along the street in front of his house. There were 5 of them: his daily driver, a sensible sedan, a vintage Mustang he was restoring, a pickup truck he used for weekend projects, and 2 vehicles belonging to his adult children who were temporarily staying with him while they saved for their own places. Every single vehicle was registered, insured, and parked in accordance with city ordinances. None were commercial vehicles, none were abandoned, and none were in disrepair beyond the Mustang, which was covered and clearly a work in progress. Marcus set the letter down on his kitchen counter and took a long sip of his coffee. The thing Patricia Whitmore and her board didn't know, the detail that had somehow escaped their attention despite 2 years of aggressive HOA enforcement, was that Marcus Chun wasn't just another homeowner in Riverside Oaks. He was the only homeowner in Riverside Oaks. Every single house on the block, all 17 properties, belonged to him. The story of how Marcus had come to own an entire city block was one of patience, strategy, and perfect timing. 5 years earlier, he had retired from a successful career in commercial real estate development. He had spent 30 years building shopping centers and office complexes, accumulating wealth and knowledge about property markets that few people possessed. When he decided to retire, he didn't want to stop working entirely. He wanted a project, something that would keep his mind sharp and provide passive income for his children and future grandchildren. Riverside Oaks had caught his attention during one of his evening drives through the suburbs. The neighborhood was older, built in the 70s, and many of the original owners were aging out or passing away. The houses were solid, well-built structures that needed updating but had good bones. The location was excellent, close to schools and shopping with easy highway access. Most importantly, the properties were undervalued because the neighborhood had a reputation problem. The HOA, under Patricia's increasingly authoritarian leadership, had become so overbearing that people were actively avoiding buying there. Marcus had started small, purchasing one property when it came on the market as an estate sale, then another, then 3 more in quick succession when a developer tried and failed to buy up the block for a commercial project. Each time, he had used different LLCs, different buyers' agents, different closing attorneys. No one had connected the dots. The HOA had no idea they were dealing with a single entity systematically acquiring their entire neighborhood. By the time Patricia Whitmore was elected HOA president, Marcus already owned 9 properties. He had been renting them out to carefully selected tenants, young families, retirees, working professionals who just wanted a quiet place to live and didn't care much about HOA politics. He had attended a few HOA meetings in those early years, sitting quietly in the back, observing Patricia's rise to power and her increasingly petty enforcement of regulations that seemed designed more to exercise control than to maintain property values. The turning point had come 2 years ago when Patricia had tried to fine one of Marcus's tenants for having a vegetable garden in their backyard. The garden wasn't visible from the street, didn't violate any actual regulation, and was beautifully maintained. But Patricia had decided it was against the spirit of the community's aesthetic standards. Marcus had intervened, quietly paying the fine and reassuring his tenant that they could keep their garden. That had been when he decided Patricia's reign needed to end, but not through confrontation, through patience. Over the next 18 months, Marcus had acquired the remaining properties on the block. Some owners had been eager to sell, tired of HOA harassment. Others had needed convincing. But Marcus's offers were always fair and usually above market value. He could afford to be generous. The last property had closed just 8 weeks ago, a corner lot whose elderly owner had moved to assisted living. With that purchase, Marcus had completed his collection. He owned the entire block, 17 houses in total, each registered under a different LLC, all of which ultimately traced back to a holding company he controlled. The HOA board had no idea. They continued sending notices, collecting dues, and enforcing their ever-expanding list of regulations. Patricia had been particularly active lately, issuing fines for basketball hoops left in driveways, for holiday decorations that stayed up too long, for mailboxes that weren't the approved shade of black. Her latest crusade was against vehicles, specifically what she deemed excessive vehicle ownership. She had pushed through a new rule limiting properties to 3 vehicles visible from the street at any time, conveniently exempting herself and her husband, who owned 4 cars, including a boat on a trailer. Marcus had watched all of this with a detached interest of someone studying an experiment. He had continued paying HOA dues for all 17 properties under their various LLC names. He had never missed a payment, never violated a legitimate regulation, and never drawn attention to his growing property empire. He had been waiting for the right moment to reveal the truth, and Patricia's letter about his cars had just provided it. The next HOA board meeting was scheduled for following Tuesday evening. These meetings were typically sparsely attended, usually just Patricia and her 3 board members, along with maybe 2 or 3 homeowners who had been summoned to answer for violations. Marcus cleared his calendar and made preparations. He spent the weekend reviewing every HOA document, every covenant, condition, and restriction that governed Riverside Oaks. He pulled together property records, LLC registrations, and documentation, showing the complete chain of ownership for every house on the block. Tuesday evening arrived with unseasonably warm weather and a clear sky. The HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building at the entrance to the neighborhood that had seen better days. Marcus arrived exactly at 7 o'clock, the official start time, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing a business suit. This was unusual. Residents typically showed up to HOA meetings in casual clothes, if they showed up at all. His formal attire immediately drew attention. Patricia Whitmore sat at the head of a long folding table, flanked by her board members: Tom Berkshire, the treasurer; Sandra Liu, the secretary; and David Pemberton, a member-at-large who rarely spoke. All 3 were Patricia's allies, selected more for their willingness to support her decisions than for any particular expertise in community management. Patricia herself was a woman in her early 60s with severely cut gray hair and an expression that suggested she had been personally offended by something 20 years ago and never gotten over it. She looked up when Marcus entered, her eyes narrowing slightly. She knew who he was, the man from the house with too many cars, but they had never spoken directly. Her interactions with residents were usually conducted through letters and formal notices, maintaining a bureaucratic distance that reinforced her authority. Marcus took a seat in the front row, setting his briefcase beside him. There were only 2 other people in attendance, both residents who had been cited for minor violations and were there to contest their fines. Patricia called the meeting to order with a sharp rap of her gavel, a melodramatic touch she had introduced 6 months ago. She worked to the standard agenda items: approval of previous meeting minutes, financial report, old business, new business. The 2 other residents made their cases and were summarily dismissed with their fines upheld. Patricia seemed to take particular pleasure in denying their appeals. Then she came to Marcus's issue. She read the violation notice into the record, describing his property as having excessive vehicles that created visual clutter and degraded property values for surrounding homes. She noted that his special assessment of $1,500 was due within 30 days, and that failure to pay would result in additional penalties and possible legal action. Marcus waited for her to finish, letting the words hang in the air. Then he stood up and approached the table. Patricia's expression shifted to one of slight alarm. Residents didn't typically approach the board table. That was her domain. But Marcus wasn't there to plead or argue. He opened his briefcase and began removing documents, placing them on the table in neat stacks: property deeds, LLC registrations, transfer records, tax documents, financial statements, page after page after page, creating an impressive array of paperwork that covered nearly half the table. Patricia stared at the documents, confusion replacing alarm. The other board members leaned in, trying to understand what they were looking at. Marcus remained silent, letting them process the information. Sandra Lou was the first to understand. Her eyes widened as she picked up one of the property deeds, then another, then a third. She began matching the LLC names to the addresses, her finger tracing lines on the documents. Tom Berkshire caught on next. He had grabbed one of the financial statements and was reading through the list of properties associated with the holding company. His face went pale as he counted, then recounted, then counted a third time. David Pemberton was slower on the uptake, but when Sandra whispered something in his ear, his jaw literally dropped open. Patricia was the last to comprehend what she was seeing. She had been focused on finding something wrong with the documents, some procedural error she could exploit. But as the reality settled over the table and her board members began exchanging panicked glances, she finally understood. The man standing before her, the man she had just threatened with a $1,500 fine, owned every single property on the block, not just his house. Every house. All 17 of them. The silence in the room was absolute. Even the air conditioning seemed to have stopped humming. Marcus remained standing, his expression neutral, waiting. He had learned long ago that in negotiations, the person who speaks first after a major revelation usually loses. Patricia tried to recover, shuffling through the documents as if she might find some mistake. But the paperwork was impeccable. Marcus had spent 30 years dealing with property transactions. His documentation was bulletproof. Every deed was properly recorded. Every LLC was properly registered. Every transfer was legitimate and legal. There was no angle to attack, no technicality to exploit. Finally, Patricia cleared her throat. Her voice, usually so commanding and sharp, came out uncertain. She asked if this meant he was the landlord for the entire block. Marcus confirmed that yes, he owned all 17 properties. Some he rented out. One, his primary residence, he occupied himself, but all of them were his. The implications began cascading through the room. Tom Berkshire, the treasurer, was doing quick mental math. 17 properties times the annual HOA dues meant Marcus was personally paying nearly 80% of the association's total revenue. The other streets in Riverside Oaks contributed the rest, but this single block was the financial backbone of the entire HOA. Sandra Lou was thinking about all the violation notices that had been sent out over the past 2 years. How many had gone to Marcus's properties? How many fines had been issued to his tenants? She began flipping through her meeting notes, her expression growing increasingly worried. David Pemberton wasn't thinking about anything particularly strategic. He was simply shocked that they had all missed this, that somehow, despite being on the board, despite reviewing financial records and processing dues payments, none of them had noticed that the same entity was paying for 17 different properties. Patricia tried to regain control of the situation. She pointed out that regardless of ownership, the rules still applied. The excessive vehicle policy was valid and had been properly voted on by the board. Marcus's property was in violation and the fine stood. Marcus let her finish. Then he asked a simple question. Under what authority did the HOA claim to enforce rules on his property? Patricia responded with indignation. The HOA had full authority under the covenants, conditions, and restrictions that governed Riverside Oaks. Every property owner had agreed to these terms when they purchased their homes. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he pointed out something interesting in the HOA's governing documents. According to the bylaws, any rule change or new policy required vote of the membership. The membership, as defined in the documents, consisted of all property owners in the HOA. A quorum required representation of at least 60% of the properties. Patricia confirmed this was correct, though she was clearly wondering where he was going with this. Marcus continued. He noted that the vehicle policy Patricia had referenced had been passed 8 months ago at a board meeting. Looking at the minutes, which Sandra had brought up on her laptop, the vote had been announced and no members had attended to contest it. The board had therefore approved it under their emergency powers, which allowed them to implement policies in the absence of member objection. This was all true, Patricia agreed, her voice tight. These were standard HOA procedures. Marcus smiled for the first time that evening. Then he pointed out that under the bylaws, any member could call for a general membership vote to overturn a board decision. Such a vote required only a simple majority of the membership to pass. Patricia's face went from confused to alarmed. She could see where this was going now. Marcus owned 17 properties. Riverside Oaks had a total of 42 homes. Marcus controlled more than 40% of the votes. Not a majority, but close. And if even a few other homeowners sided with him, which seemed likely given Patricia's reputation, he could overturn any rule the board had passed. But Marcus wasn't done. He continued examining the bylaws, his finger tracing down the page of a printed copy he had brought with him. He noted another interesting provision. The HOA board consisted of 4 positions: president, treasurer, secretary, and member at large. These positions were elected annually by the membership. The next election was scheduled for 3 months from now. Tom Berkshire made a small sound, something between a cough and a gasp. He had suddenly realized what Marcus was really saying. With 17 votes, Marcus could elect the entire board himself. He didn't need to convince anyone. He didn't need to campaign. He could simply nominate 4 people, vote for them with his 17 properties, and take complete control of the HOA. Patricia stood up abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She declared that this was absurd, that one person owning multiple properties didn't mean they got multiple votes. The HOA was designed to represent residents, not corporate landlords accumulating properties. Marcus responded calmly. He understood her concern, but the bylaws were clear. Voting rights were tied to property ownership, not residency. 1 property, 1 vote. This was standard across virtually all HOAs and was specifically spelled out in Riverside Oaks governing documents. If Patricia wanted to challenge this, she could bring it up with the HOA's attorney, but Marcus was confident the law would support his interpretation. Sandra Lou was frankly typing on her laptop, pulling up the actual legal code governing homeowners associations in their state. After a moment of reading, her shoulders slumped. She looked at Patricia and gave a small shake of her head. Marcus was right. The law was clear. The meeting had derailed completely. Patricia tried to regain order, but the momentum was gone. David Pemberton asked what Marcus wanted. It was the first time he had spoken all evening, and his voice was resigned, accepting that they had lost whatever power they thought they had. Marcus returned to his seat and leaned back, considering the question. What did he want? It was a fair thing to ask. He could destroy the HOA entirely if he wanted, with his voting power. He could dissolve the association, terminate all the rules and restrictions, and turn Riverside Oaks into a free-for-all. Or he could take it over and run it as his personal fiefdom, exactly as Patricia had been doing, but with even more control. Instead, Marcus outlined a different vision. He wanted the HOA to go back to its original purpose, maintaining common areas, organizing neighborhood events, and enforcing only those rules that genuinely protected property values and quality of life. He wanted an end to the petty harassment, the vindictive fines for minor aesthetic preferences, and the authoritarian approach that had driven away potential buyers and made current residents miserable. He suggested that Patricia and her board could either work with him to reform the HOA, or he would call for an immediate special election and replace them. The choice was theirs. He wasn't interested in being HOA president himself. He had better things to do, but he would happily find and elect 4 people who shared his vision of a reasonable, functional homeowners association. Patricia sat back down, her expression a mixture of fury and defeat. She had spent 4 years building her power base, expanding the rules, establishing her authority. Now it was all crumbling because she had gone after the wrong person. If she had just ignored the cars, if she had just let this one violation slide, she would have remained ignorant of Marcus's property empire. But her need to enforce every rule, to exercise control over every detail, had led her to challenge the one person who could end her reign with a single vote. Tom Berkshire tried to find a middle ground. He suggested they could review the vehicle policy, perhaps increase the limit to 5 vehicles per property. Surely that would be acceptable to Marcus. It would allow him to keep his cars without the fine, and the HOA could maintain some level of regulation. Marcus considered this for a moment, then declined. The issue wasn't really about the cars or the specific number allowed. The issue was the underlying philosophy. The HOA had become focused on restriction and control rather than service and community. Changing one rule wouldn't fix that. What was needed was a complete reset of priorities. Sandra Lou, who had been quiet since her initial shock, spoke up. She admitted that she had joined the board thinking she would be helping maintain a nice neighborhood. Instead, she had found herself sending violation notices to people for things like having the wrong shade of mulch in their flower beds or parking their cars facing the wrong direction. She was tired of it. If Marcus wanted to reform the HOA, she would support him. This was a crack in the board's unity, and Marcus recognized it. He thanked Sandra for her honesty and asked if she would be willing to stay on as secretary under reformed administration. She agreed immediately, relief visible on her face. David Pemberton, seeing the way the wind was blowing, also indicated he would support reform. He had never been particularly invested in Patricia's aggressive enforcement policies anyway. Tom Berkshire held out longer, but eventually he too agreed. The financial reality was inescapable. Without Marcus's dues payments, the HOA would be bankrupt within 6 months. They had no leverage, no power, and no options. Patricia could continue fighting, but she would be fighting alone. Patricia Whitmore sat in silence, staring at the table covered in property documents. Her entire identity for the past 4 years had been wrapped up in being HOA president. She had relished the authority, the ability to shape the neighborhood according to her vision of perfection. Now that was gone. She could resign with some dignity intact, or she could force Marcus to remove her through a vote, which would be humiliating. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its usual command. She said she would need some time to think about her position. Marcus nodded and said that was fine. He would give her 1 week to decide. If she wanted to stay on and work within the new framework, he would accept that. If she wanted to resign, he would respect that decision. But if she tried to continue the old ways, he would call for an immediate special election. The meeting adjourned without any official votes or resolutions. The other 2 residents who had come to contest their violations had left at some point during the confrontation, probably sensing they should make themselves scarce. Marcus collected his documents, returned them to his briefcase, and left Clubhouse. The night air felt cool and clean after the tension of the meeting. Over the following week, Riverside Oaks went through a quiet revolution. Patricia submitted her resignation as HOA president via email, copying the entire board. She stated that she was stepping down for personal reasons and wished the association well. Nobody believed the personal reasons excuse, but nobody challenged it either. Her resignation was accepted unanimously. Tom Berkshire also resigned, recognizing that his close association with Patricia made his position untenable. Sandra Lou agreed to stay on as secretary, and David Pemberton agreed to serve as interim president until proper elections could be held. Marcus worked with them to identify 2 other residents who might be good board members, people who were respected in the community and had no history of petty enforcement. The vehicle policy was immediately suspended pending review. The $1,500 fine against Marcus was officially voided. A letter went out to all Riverside Oaks residents explaining that the HOA was undergoing restructuring and that many of the more onerous rules would be reviewed and likely eliminated or modified. The response from the community was overwhelmingly positive. Several of Marcus's tenants approached him to thank him for intervening. They had been frustrated by the constant violation notices and fines, but had felt powerless to challenge the board. Now they felt like they could actually enjoy living in the neighborhood without constantly worrying about HOA harassment. One particular conversation stood out. An elderly tenant named Mrs. Rodriguez had been fined repeatedly for having bird feeders in her yard, something Patricia had decided attracted too many birds and created a mess. Mrs. Rodriguez loved watching the birds. It was her primary source of entertainment, since she couldn't drive anymore and spent most days at home. She had been on the verge of moving out when Marcus intervened. She told him through tears of gratitude that she could keep her bird feeders now and stay in her home. That moment crystallized for Marcus why he had done all of this. It wasn't about winning or defeating Patricia. It was about allowing people to live their lives without unnecessary interference. The reforms continued over the next several months. The new board, working with Marcus's input but not his direct involvement, went through every rule and regulation. They eliminated roughly two-thirds of them. Gone were the restrictions on vegetable gardens, bird feeders, basketball hoops, and vehicle numbers. Gone were the fines for minor aesthetic variations like mailbox colors or house number styles. What remained were genuine community standards: no abandoned vehicles, no trash accumulation, maintenance of basic property appearance, and reasonable noise restrictions. The HOA's focus shifted to actually serving the community. They organized a neighborhood block party, the first in 6 years. They established a maintenance fund for the community playground, which had been neglected. They created a neighborhood watch program that was about safety rather than spying on code violations. They even started a community garden in the common area near the clubhouse, the kind of thing Patricia would have never allowed, but that brought residents together. Property values in Riverside Oaks began to rise. Word spread that the neighborhood had fixed its HOA problem, and suddenly, homes that came on the market were receiving multiple offers. Marcus's investment strategy was paying off beyond his initial projections. Not only was he collecting rent from quality tenants, but his properties were appreciating faster than comparable homes in nearby neighborhoods. The story of what happened spread through local real estate circles. HOA reform became a selling point. Realtors would tell potential buyers that Riverside Oaks had been taken over by a reasonable ownership group that actually cared about residents rather than petty enforcement. The neighborhood that had once been avoided because of its HOA reputation became sought after because of its reformed governance. Marcus continued living in his house with his 5 cars parked wherever he wanted. His adult children eventually moved out into places of their own, taking 2 of the vehicles with them. But the principle had been established. Residents had the freedom to live their lives without micromanagement from an authoritarian board. Patricia Whitmore moved out of Riverside Oaks 6 months after her resignation. She sold her house to Marcus, who made a fair offer that she accepted without negotiation. In a final ironic twist, he became the owner of her former home too, bringing his total to 18 properties. He renovated it and rented it to a young couple with 3 kids and 2 dogs, the kind of family Patricia would have hated having as neighbors. The couple's kids played basketball in the driveway. Their dogs barked occasionally. They had holiday decorations that stayed up a little too long, and nobody fined them or sent threatening letters. They were just allowed to be a normal family in a normal neighborhood, which was exactly what Marcus had wanted all along. One evening, about a year after the confrontation at the HOA meeting, Marcus sat on his front porch with a beer, watching the sun set over his neighborhood. His vintage Mustang was finally finished, a beautiful restored piece of automotive history parked proudly in his driveway. Kids rode bikes in the street. Neighbors chatted across yards. Someone a few houses down was grilling, the smell of barbecue drifting on the evening air. This was what an HOA was supposed to enable, not prevent. Community, connection, people living their lives without fear of being reported for trivial violations. Marcus has spent his career building physical structures, shopping centers, and office buildings. But this neighborhood full of life and actual community might have been his best development project yet. He raised his beer in a silent toast to Patricia Whitmore wherever she was. She had taught him an important lesson about power and control. Sometimes the person who appears to hold all the cards is one revelation away from losing everything. And sometimes the quiet person in the back of the room, the one nobody pays attention to, is actually the one who owns the whole board. The HOA never bothered Marcus about his cars again. In fact, the HOA never bothered anyone about anything unreasonable again. The association continued to function, handling the legitimate business of maintaining common areas and organizing community events. But it did so with the understanding that it existed to serve the residents, not to control them. Marcus eventually sold a few of the properties, diversifying his investments while maintaining majority ownership on the block. He kept careful control of who he sold to, making sure the new owners shared a philosophy about reasonable community standards. The neighborhood culture he had worked to establish was preserved. The story became a legend in local property management circles. Real estate investors would reference the Riverside Oak situation as an example of strategic property acquisition and the importance of understanding HOA bylaws. HOA board members would hear about Patricia's downfall as a cautionary tale about overreach and the dangers of authoritarian governance. But for the residents of Riverside Oaks, it was simply the story of how their neighborhood went from a place of constant stress and petty harassment to a genuine community where people wanted to live. And it had all started with a letter about too many cars and a man who had been patient enough to own an entire block before revealing his hand. If you found this story satisfying, please like and subscribe to the channel. Have you ever dealt with an overbearing HOA or a power-hungry board member? Share your experiences in the comments below. And remember, sometimes the best revenge isn't loud and immediate. Sometimes it's quiet, strategic, and absolutely devastating. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.